Tina, you have to. My mother's voice crackled on the phone, a mixture of pleading and that familiar, guilt-inducing tone that I learned to recognize as a child. I was standing in my spacious Manhattan office with a breathtaking view of the horizon, but I hardly noticed it now because I was trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Apparently, my parents, without even bothering to consult with me, gave my sister Jessica permission to live in one of my investment properties, a townhouse in Chicago, which I purchased with my own honestly earned money. And you didn't think to ask me first? Trying to keep my voice steady, I gripped the phone tighter. It's just temporary, Tina, her mother sighed. Jessica is going through such a difficult time after the divorce. She has nowhere else to go, and you are doing so well with your career in New York that you don't even use this house. I closed my eyes, mentally counting to 10. At the age of 32, I worked hard building a career as an investment banker, saving every penny to invest in real estate, and this townhouse was my first serious investment, my pride. I carefully renovated it, planning to rent it out at the market price, and now I find out that my sister, without paying a cent, has already moved her things there. Besides, my mother continued, as if she hadn't noticed my silence, she's family. The family helps the family. The irony of those words pierced me. Where was that infamous family first when I was struggling through college while working 3 jobs at the same time? Whereas Jessica was having fun with her life, spending money from the trust fund paid for by our parents. How long has she been living there? I asked, already afraid to hear the answer. Just a few days. She moved in last weekend. Your father gave her a spare key, the one we kept in case of emergencies. Of course, the emergency key that I entrusted to them is now being used to allow my unemployed sister to live freely on my property. And when exactly were you going to tell me about this? Well, we're telling you now, dear, the mother cheerfully replied, as if that was enough. Besides, Jessica is so happy. She is already talking about repainting some rooms to revitalize the space. My stomach clenched uncomfortably. She's what? Oh, nothing serious, just a few accent walls. You know how good she is at interior design. Do you remember when she even wanted to become a decorator? Oh, yes, I remembered. Just like her photography phase, yoga instructor phase, and passion for opening an organic juice bar. All these expensive experiments were funded by our parents, and none of them brought any results. Mom, she can't just. Tina, please, she interrupted, and the pleading sounded in her voice again. Can't you just help your sister? She's family. I took a deep breath, letting my mind collect itself. A plan was already forming in my head. You're right, Mom. She's a family. Oh, honey, I knew you'd understand. You've always been so reasonable. I mumbled something unintelligible as I opened my laptop and logged into my bank records. I have to go. I have a meeting with a client. After finishing the conversation, I leaned back in my chair, and a slight smile played on my lips. What my family didn't know was that I had long anticipated such a scenario. Ever since Jessica got divorced, I've watched my parents rush to her rescue over and over again. I saw how their views gradually shifted in my direction, as their thoughts began to revolve around my success, my stability, my assets. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick folder labeled Chicago Real Estate in Cyberspace, which I had prepared with my lawyer 6 months ago in case of exactly the situation that it was now. Inside were legal notices, detailed ownership rules, copies of contracts, and, most importantly, documents confirming that the townhouse was no longer solely mine. It now officially belonged to my limited liability company, which meant it was protected by strict legal protocols governing who could dispose of it and under what conditions. Illegal living in this house now not only caused me moral inconvenience, but also was a direct violation of property rights, which, from a legal point of view, made the situation much more serious. I spent months creating this structure, anticipating that at some point family, emergency circumstances, would draw attention to my assets again, and I was not mistaken. The phone vibrated, and a message from Jessica flashed on the screen. "Thank you for letting me spend the night with you. You're the best big sister in the world, Beth. By the way, do you mind if I redo the kitchen cabinets? These are so old." I pressed my lips together, not bothering to answer. Of course, she no longer considered this house as a temporary shelter, but perceived it as her own, so much so that she even decided what changes could be made in it. Given her character, I could only guess what her redesign would result in. Instead of wasting time getting annoyed, I reached for the office phone and dialed my lawyer's number. "Sarah, this is Tina. Do you remember that real estate scenario in Chicago that we discussed?" There was no surprise in her voice, just businesslike concentration. "Is this happening?" "Exactly as we predicted. Can you start the process?" Sarah and I spent the next hour going through the documents in detail and making final adjustments. I have instructed to notify the management company, prepare official notices, and activate the corporate supervision protocols. Now, Jessica's every move in this house was recorded on a legal level, turning her stay there into a problem requiring official permission. "What about your parents?" Sarah asked as we checked the last details. "They probably won't be happy when they figure out what you're doing." I grinned at the screen. "They will find out about it when they can't change anything anymore. In addition, they themselves gave up the right to vote the moment they gave out my spare key without my knowledge." A new message beep sounded. I opened the mail tab and frowned. The sender is Jessica. There was no text in the letter, just a few attached images, photographs of furniture that she was obviously going to purchase to equip her new home. I had no doubt that all this was bought with my parents' credit card, because, despite her love of beautiful things, she never had her own funds for such expenses. "How soon do you want to start the process?" Sarah asked again. I thought about it, replaying in my head all those years when I watched Jessica take advantage of our parents' generosity with impunity, without thinking about the consequences. How many times have I had to give in because it was expected of me? How many times have I been told that the family should help the family, meaning that I should be the one to help, while they didn't ask her anything? "Let's give it 6 months, I finally said. 6. Sarah asked. "Long enough for them to think they got away with it. Long enough for Jessica to fully settle in and stop waiting for a trick. Long enough for everyone to forget whose property it really is." And then I fell silent, and Sarah didn't urge me on. "And then we'll remind them," I continued after a pause, "why you can't take what doesn't belong to you, even if you're a family member." I spent the following weeks watching from afar as Jessica documented her new life on social media. She posted photos of cozy interiors that she created on my square meters, told subscribers how sometimes the universe just provides, posted videos with decor updates, proudly showing an antique chandelier that she hung in the dining room. I knew that she didn't think about what she was doing. For her it was a game, another stage, a new beginning, as she liked to say. But I also knew that every step she took was being recorded. I saved every post, every photo, every story in which she bragged about her new home. She was unknowingly creating the perfect legal dossier for me. My parents called regularly, each time skillfully circumventing the very essence of what was happening, as if discussing anything but the obvious. They enthusiastically talked about Jessica's new life, about how the house I had invested so much effort and money in was being transformed, without mentioning rent, utility bills, or the fact that they had arbitrarily given away my property without my consent, as if it were a matter of course. "Jessica is much better now," Mom exclaimed during one of these conversations. Her voice sounded joyful, even excited, as if she didn't notice the cold reserve in my answers. "She finally finds herself, can you imagine? And it's all thanks to you, darling. You're such a good sister." I made an evasive mumble, not giving her any reason to delve into the subject, while at the same time I was saving another batch of photos capturing unauthorized changes in the house to a folder. My document file has rapidly thickened, becoming more and more compelling evidence of violations that will become indisputable in exactly 5 months and 3 weeks. By the way, honey, Mom added hesitantly, as if afraid that her new request would be too obvious, I've been thinking. Maybe we can put the utilities in Jessica's name? It would help her create a credit history after the divorce. You know how important it is for her. I chuckled slightly as I lifted the phone to my lips. Actually, Mom, I have an important meeting starting right now, I said in a flat voice, trying not to sound sarcastic. Let's discuss this later. That evening, a letter from the management company appeared in my mailbox. They confirmed that all activities in the house are carefully recorded, every repair, every change, every violation of corporate property rules has been documented and dated. Ironically, almost immediately, my phone vibrated again, and a message from Jessica flashed on the screen. Hi, sis. Quick question. Would it be okay if I put up one of the available rooms on Airbnb? Just to make some extra money while I'm looking for a job. I felt the corners of my lips twitch in an involuntary grin. Of course, there were no boundaries for Jessica, only endless opportunities to use other people's resources without thinking about the consequences. I added a screenshot of the message to the documentation file and took a quick look at the calendar. There are 5 months and 2 weeks left. This has long gone beyond the issue of ownership. It has become a matter of respecting boundaries. My personal lesson for the family, so that they finally realize that my success does not mean that they can endlessly use my resources without thinking about the consequences. And there really will be consequences. Exactly 5 months after the start of Jessica's new life, I received the final report from the management company. I sat in my office, flipping through page after page, feeling a strange mixture of anger and satisfaction building up inside. The document described in detail all the unauthorized changes made to the house. The amount exceeded $23,000, which was the cost of the illegal alterations carried out by my sister. In addition, she violated building regulations with her amateur improvements, and most importantly, the management company collected indisputable evidence of the illegal rental of my home through Airbnb. I scrolled down the report, reading the attached files. Jessica completely remodeled the house to fit her idea of a bohemian dream space. The elegant gray walls, which I had chosen with such care to create a modern, stylish interior, were now covered with garish strokes of abstract paint. She called it art in motion. She sold the high-end household appliances that I had installed for a long-term lease, replacing them with cheaper models, and, judging by her social media accounts, used the proceeds for decor and new art projects. I opened the tab with her Instagram profile and quickly scrolled through her posts over the past months. The photos showed vintage lamps, ornate armchairs, colorful cushions, low tables made from old drawers, Oriental-style lamps. In one post, she enthusiastically told subscribers how she was inspired by Paris in the 1920s and turned her home into a cozy creative space. In another, she shared a video of the process of creating unique epoxy patterns right on the wooden floors that I had so carefully restored. I felt my fingers tighten on the mouse. She didn't just live in my house for free. She changed him beyond recognition. And, most importantly, she was sure that this house belonged to her. I looked at the calendar. There was only 1 week left. My phone vibrated with another message, and as soon as I looked at the screen, I already knew who it was from. Tina, you'll never believe how amazing the house looks now. I'm thinking about starting a blog about renovation. Maybe it will become my new career. I let out a short, barely perceptible laugh that wasn't funny. After saving the screenshot to the documentation folder, I opened the calendar. 2 weeks. There was so much left before the corporate audit, which I had planned in advance, prudently choosing a date after which my family would no longer have the opportunity to change anything. 2 weeks until the moment, and my parents and Jessica finally realized that their ideas about property and reality are significantly different. Are you sure about the timing? Sarah asked during our last meeting. Your sister's birthday is just the day after the notifications are sent. I chuckled, remembering the invitation I received last week. Jessica was going to have not just a party, but a real celebration of her new life, a grand housewarming party, coinciding with her birthday, on a scale appropriate to her habits. She has already invited 50 people, hired catering services, and, of course, did not spend a cent of her own money on it. As always, our parents covered the costs. The timing is perfect, I replied calmly. Let him celebrate. This will make the news the next morning even more impressive. On the eve of the audit, my mother called me. Tina, dear. You're coming to Jessica's party tomorrow, right? She has done so much to turn this house into a real cozy corner. Everyone is just dying to see what she's done. I looked out the window at Manhattan in the evening, where the lights of the offices were twinkling, like small fragments of stars in glass towers. Actually, Mom, I have business in Chicago tomorrow. I'll come in. Oh, that's wonderful. She exclaimed with joy, which she did not even try to hide. Jessica will be so happy. She keeps saying that she wants you to come more often to see how she turned your old investment property into a real home. My old investment property. It was as if I had abandoned this house, and Jessica had graciously taken it under her wing, doing me a favor. By the way, my mother added, and her voice took on that soft, careful tone that always preceded requests to which I had to say no. Your father and I have been thinking. Jessica has done so much to improve this place. She has tried so hard. Maybe we should discuss the possibility of transferring ownership to her. You're doing so well in New York, and that would help her finally get back on her feet. I gripped the phone tighter, allowing myself a short pause to hide the sarcasm in my voice. We can discuss this tomorrow night, I replied, breaking the call. The next morning, I boarded a flight to Chicago, carrying the documents that were supposed to put everything in its place. My briefcase contained copies of the corporate audit, legal notices, and detailed documentation for each unauthorized change, as well as police reports from neighbors complaining about the constant stream of strangers in the house, and, finally, evidence that Jessica illegally earned income by renting rooms through Airbnb. Arriving at the facility a few hours before the party, I immediately headed inside. The management company and my lawyer were already there, along with a licensed contractor I hired to assess the damage. This is a nightmare, the contractor muttered, briefly inspecting the premises. The electrical wiring in the kitchen does not meet the standards at all. Are these epoxy floors? They weren't even properly sealed. And the load-bearing wall that she removed to free up space. I just hope that the ceiling doesn't collapse on the guests in the midst of her celebration. I saved his comments in the documentation, then looked at the clock. 3 hours before the party starts. The phone vibrated. Where are you? The catering service is already here, and I need help setting it up. Oh, wait until you see what I've done to your old home office. Now it's a meditation room with a water element. I closed my eyes and inhaled, suppressing a short laugh. In a few hours, Jessica will receive the most unexpected birthday present. I forwarded Jessica's message to my lawyer, and Sarah replied almost immediately, confirming that she had added it to our file. Everything is ready. Do you want us to hand over the notifications during the party or after? I looked at the screen, remembering for a second my mother's voice and her accidentally dropped offer to transfer ownership to Jessica, the self-confidence with which my family disposed of what did not belong to them, their sincere belief that my success automatically meant their right to enjoy its fruits. For 6 months, I watched them celebrate, as Jessica redecorated, bragged about her house, as my parents indulged her whims, completely ignoring the issue of real ownership. And now, with only a few hours left before the inevitable, I have no doubts left. Let them celebrate first, I wrote back. Let them enjoy their triumph. And then we'll remind them who owns this house. The guests started arriving at 4 o'clock sharp. I watched from the car parked across the street as Jessica beamed, greeting friends at the entrance, flawlessly playing the role of a hospitable hostess, laughing happily, giving hugs and conducting tours of the house she considered her own. Through the windows, I could see my parents standing in the living room, smiling proudly, while Jessica enthusiastically told a group of guests about the creative changes she had made to the interior. Obviously, they were just as willing to believe in her new life as they were to believe in the illusion that this house now belonged to her. At exactly 5:30 a.m., when the party was in full swing, when music and laughter resounded through the courtyard, my real estate management team arrived at the place with official notices in their hands. I got out of the car, slowly straightening my jacket, feeling the calmness that accompanied me in moments of confidence. I was walking towards the house that I had bought over the years of hard work and careful planning, the house that was now going to be the site of a lesson that my family would probably never forget. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones you mistakenly thought were free. Tina. Jessica squealed with joy as soon as she saw me, rushing towards me with open arms. You're finally here. Isn't the house amazing? I've done so much with him. Behind her, I noticed her parents, their faces glowing with pride, as if they had personally participated in every change. They hadn't noticed the team that was following me yet, people in formal suits with tablets and documents in their hands. Yes, I said calmly, letting a small smile slip across my lips. Let's talk about what exactly you did to my property. The silence that swept through the room was almost palpable. The guests began to look around, champagne glasses froze in their hands, and Jessica, whose smile slowly began to fade, blinked, as if she did not immediately understand what was happening. Sarah stepped forward, holding a heavy folder in her hands. Jessica, she said in a professional, emotionless tone. This is an official notice of unauthorized occupancy and trespassing issued by EJM Holdings LLC, the rightful owner of this house. EJM Holdings? Jessica's voice sounded confused as she looked from me to the documents. The glass of champagne froze halfway to her lips, and her hand trembled slightly as she took the top sheet from the stack. Her eyes scanned the text, her expression changed to bewilderment, and then panic began to form. What does that mean? My father took a step forward, his brows furrowed. Tina, what's going on? I stood quietly, watching as the guests began to look at each other and whisper. EJM Holdings is my legal entity, Dad. I paused, letting them make sense of what I'd said. The property was transferred to the company 6 months ago. About the same time you gave Jessica my emergency key. The mother's face froze in an anxious grimace. But it's just a formality, right? Her voice was trembling, but she still clung to the familiar picture of the world. It's still your house, Tina, just a legal quirk. I shook my head. No, Mom. This is corporate property. And corporate ownership is governed by strict rules and regulations. Rules that have been repeatedly violated over the past 6 months. At this point, Jessica's boyfriend, a self-proclaimed real estate investor she met on a yoga retreat, felt the need to step in. Hey, come on, this is a family matter. He grinned, taking a step forward and folding his arms over his chest. You're not seriously going to use all this corporate gibberish, are you? It's just a house. I turned my head to him, studying him with cold interest. Just a house? I repeated slowly. Just as a business that you would like to open? Or just as investments that people formalize legally in order to protect their property? He opened his mouth, but I didn't give him time to respond, shifting my gaze back to Jessica. It has always been difficult for you to understand the boundaries, but now you have completely crossed them. You didn't just live in this house for free, Jessica. You handled him like he belonged to you. You made illegal changes by renting out rooms and making money from it without paying a single cent of rent or taxes. I stepped forward, letting my voice grow stronger. And now it's time to pay the bills. Sarah calmly pulled another document out of the folder and glanced at the gathered crowd, in which no one was laughing now, no one was reaching for a glass of champagne anymore, no one was whispering with smiles on their faces, everyone was just watching with bated breath, waiting for what would happen next. Actually, we're very serious, she began, her voice flat and firm, as if she were reading out the terms of a contract that left no room for doubt or objection. We have documentary evidence of numerous violations of building regulations, illegal structural changes, and, most worryingly, facts of illegal subletting. There was silence in the room, as if all the sounds of the party had suddenly disappeared into the thick air of misunderstanding and incipient panic. The champagne glass, which Jessica was still holding in her trembling hand, slipped from her fingers and crashed with a loud clink on the epoxy-coated floors, of which she was so proud. They were just temporary guests. She exclaimed, her voice trembled, but there was still an attempt to justify herself, to pull the situation back into a channel convenient for her. Friends who just stayed with me for a couple of nights. Friends who paid you $200 a night through Airbnb? I tilted my head slightly, showing the screen of my phone, which showed screenshots of her ad, where she advertised this house as a cozy designer townhouse with an author's renovation. Jessica's face turned pale, her lips trembled, and her eyes darted in the direction of her parents, but even they could not immediately find the words. Listen here, Tina, the father stepped forward, his face assumed that stern, imperious mask, which he used to achieve his own. Your sister needed help. We just gave away my property that didn't belong to you? I interrupted him, but my voice remained calm. Did they just allow unauthorized reconstructions that violated the structural integrity of the building? Did you just turn a blind eye to the illegal rental business that Jessica was running on my property? The contractor who had previously inspected the house took a step forward, holding a tablet with a report in his hands. Ma'am, do you want me to tell you in detail about the revealed violations of the code? Jessica moaned and burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. It's not fair. She sobbed, her voice rising to hysteria. I've made this place better. Look how beautiful it is here. Doesn't it matter? I looked around slowly, as if I were really considering her improvements. The demolished load-bearing wall, which now threatened the safety of the building. Amateur wiring that could lead to a short circuit and fire. Sticky epoxy floors that have already started to bubble from improper application. Better? I looked at her. You've created thousands of dollars in damage and violations that will now have to be fixed. Thousands. My mother, who had been standing off to the side with her eyes wide all this time, suddenly whispered. Thousands. Sarah nodded and calmly flipped through the documents. The initial estimate for bringing the property into compliance with the code is about $45,000, she said, as if voicing the amount of someone's order in a restaurant. And that's only before we get to the issue of illegally obtained rental income. My father turned purple. This is ridiculous. He growled, clenching his fists. You can't do this to your own sister. I met his gaze steadily. Actually, I can. And I'm not doing anything. It's just the consequences. The voices of the guests became louder, people began to look at each other. Someone took out their phones. Someone carefully backed away to the exit, realizing that they were not present at an ordinary evening, but at a catastrophe unfolding live. The property manager who came with us stepped forward, holding a new set of documents in his hands. We have an official record of every unauthorized change, every violation of the code, and every illegal rental transaction. We also have evidence that the original pieces of furniture and household appliances were sold online. Jessica abruptly raised her head, and her tears immediately turned to anger. Those ugly devices? Her voice was harsh, filled with accusation. I replaced them with better things. I looked at her coldly. These ugly devices were commercial grade and cost more than $115,000. I paused, watching the meaning of the words slowly sink in. You had no right to sell them. My mother took a step toward me, her slender fingers on my wrist in a desperate attempt to hold me back, to turn the situation back to the one where I was malleable, where I was yielding, as always. Tina, please, she spoke softly, pleading in her voice. We can work this out as a family. We don't need to get into all this legal nonsense. I gently removed her hand and looked into her eyes. That's where you're wrong, Mom. I paused, letting the words settle in before continuing. It stopped being a family matter the moment you and Dad decided to give away property that didn't belong to you. That's when Jessica started considering my investment as her personal renovation project. I looked around the room, which a minute ago had been filled with laughter, but now it was oppressively silent. Now it's a legal matter. But I had to start all over again. Jessica wailed, sobbing as if not only the walls of her illusions had collapsed in front of her, but also the whole world that she had built around her confidence that other people's resources would always be at her disposal. Your new start doesn't give you the right to my property, I snapped at her, keeping my tone level, hiding an iron patience that had lasted too long. Your divorce does not give you the right to make unauthorized changes, sell things that do not belong to you, or run an illegal rental business. The party, which 10 minutes ago was filled with laughter, twinkling glasses, and carefree chatter, has now turned into a tense spectacle, which no one wanted to be a spectator. The guests left the house one by one, trying to move as quietly as possible, as if afraid to attract attention, leaving behind half-empty glasses, plates with untouched food, and a feeling of awkwardness that hung in the air like a heavy weight. Jessica's boyfriend, the real estate investor, mysteriously disappeared as soon as the legal consequences began, along with most of her so-called friends, who had recently admired her transformed house. Sarah cleared her throat slightly, drawing attention to herself, and without changing her expression, she continued. According to our records, Miss Jessica Harrison earned about $22,000 on illegal short-term rental of corporate property. This money, along with the proceeds from the sale of corporate assets, is subject to refund. Jessica collapsed onto her vintage sofa, her hands clenched into fists, and a mixture of horror, despair, and anger spread across her face. I don't have that kind of money, she almost whispered, looking from Sarah to her parents, hoping that at least someone would come to her aid. I spend it on improving this place. Improvement? I let out a small laugh that didn't have any humor in it. You mean the damage? Every change you've made without permission. Every reconstruction without proper permits. Every violation of building regulations. It's all documented. And all this will have to be fixed. My father took one last desperate step, trying to play on my sense of responsibility, which he and my mother had used all these years. Tina, be reasonable. His voice sounded strained, but he still hoped to turn the situation in his favor. What do you want from your sister? Where should she go? I met his gaze confidently, evenly, and firmly, not giving the slightest chance to sway my decision. It's not my problem, Dad. I paused, giving him a chance to realize that this argument was no longer working. Just like it wasn't your property to give away. I looked at Jessica, and her face contorted, but now not only with anger, but with the realization that the game was over. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises and begin paying off the damage and illegal rental income. Mom gasped, her hand shot up to her chest in a dramatic gesture, but now it could neither make me change my mind nor cause me regret. But all her stuff is here. She screamed, as if this was an argument that would change everything. She built a life here. I looked at her calmly, even with a slight amount of sympathy, not because I was touched by her words, but because she really believed in them. She's built a life on stolen property. Sarah put the documents in a folder and looked at her mother with professionally honed politeness. 30 days is a courtesy, considering the scale of the violations. We could request an immediate evacuation. Jessica jumped to her feet, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. You can't do this. She rushed to her parents, grabbing her father's hand like a child who demands to be protected from injustice. Mom, Dad, tell her. Tell her she can't do it. I watched as my parents exchanged glances, and for the first time in all this time, their faces did not have the confidence with which they had previously tried to put pressure on me. For the first time, they began to realize that they had no control over the situation. Their careless attitude towards my property rights, their unconditional belief that Jessica's needs were more important than my right to own what I had honestly earned, all this crumbled in front of them into ruins, which they now had to clear up. I allowed myself a short pause before saying, "The property will be restored to its original condition." I looked at Jessica, whose breathing was already labored from nervous tension. Any expenses not covered by the money returned from the illegal lease will be borne by you. Are you saying that? Her voice trailed off, and her hands clenched into fists. Yes, Jessica, I nodded calmly. And, if necessary, we will file a lawsuit. My mother gasped, her eyes filled with tears. A lawsuit? She whispered, as if it were the worst possible betrayal. Are you really ready to sue your own sister? I slowly tilted my head to the side, looking at her carefully before asking a question. Do you like how you tried to manipulate me into giving her ownership? My mother flinched, her face twitched, but I continued, not giving her a chance to turn away. Yes, Mom, I heard your suggestion earlier. Consider this my answer. The property manager stepped forward and handed out the final copies of the notices. Any messages on this issue should now go through our legal department. His voice was perfectly polite, but devoid of any hint of sympathy. Any attempts to further change ownership or continue the illegal lease will result in immediate legal action. I turned around, heading for the exit, leaving behind a party that had turned into a battlefield, leaving behind my family, who were now facing the consequences of their own decisions for the first time. Then I paused for a moment and, without turning around, said, "Oh, and Jessica." She looked up at me with horrified eyes. "Happy birthday." I smiled. Consider this your wake-up call. When I left the house, my house, I heard Jessica's sobs, my mother's pleas, and my father's angry mutterings, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace that even those sounds couldn't shake. Sometimes standing my ground means being the bad guy in someone else's story, but I'd rather be the bad guy than what they were trying to make me into. They may call me cruel, they may portray me as a heartless corporate sister who doesn't want to help her family, they may retell this story, making me look worse, but I knew the truth. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a family is to let them face the consequences of their actions. It's been 6 months since that disastrous birthday party for Jessica. I was standing in my newly renovated apartment in Chicago, surveying the changes. The walls regained their original elegant gray color, the load-bearing wall was restored in full compliance with building regulations, and new commercial-grade appliances shone in the kitchen. Every repair was documented, every violation was fixed, and all traces of Jessica's so-called improvements were erased. The cost of the restoration was $67,000, significantly more than the initial estimate. When the contractor started work, it became clear that the damage extended further than expected: hidden cracks, weakened beams, and unprofessionally installed wiring that could lead to a fire. After lengthy negotiations through our lawyers, Jessica agreed to a repayment plan using her share of the inheritance from her grandparents to cover the damage and illegal rental income. The phone buzzed with a new message. It was the first private message from Jessica in months. "Can we talk?" No lawyers, no drama. Just the sisters. I already wanted to ignore him, but something in me has changed over the months. Coffee. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Shop in front of my house. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt it was time to listen to her. The next morning, when I entered the coffee shop, I almost didn't recognize my sister. Gone were the bohemian outfits, the eccentric jewelry, the carefree expression she used to hide her irresponsibility. Instead, a woman in a business casual suit was sitting in front of me, with her hair pulled back and an open laptop in front of her. She looked focused, collected, and for the first time in a long time, an adult. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said softly as I sat across from her, looking at me with a seriousness I hadn't expected from her. I nodded, taking a leisurely sip of my coffee. "I've been thinking a lot," she sighed, folding her hands on the table. "Oh." I pursed my lips, restraining myself from making a pointed remark. "You were right." Those 3 words struck me more than anything I expected to hear. "You surprised me, Tina." Jessica smiled faintly, but there was no sarcasm or defensive tone in her voice. "I took advantage of you. I thought that since you were successful, since you are my sister, it automatically gives me some kind of right to your property. I didn't respect what you built." I continued to drink my coffee in silence, letting her talk, letting the words flow out without my interference. "These last months have been educational," she chuckled again, but there was no bitterness in her tone. "Live with mom and dad. Actually plan a budget. Face the real consequences of their decisions." It turned out that I wasn't as helpless as I always thought. She turned the laptop screen toward me, and I took a quick look at what was there. A business plan. A clear, structured document with calculations, market analysis, and a development strategy. "Do you remember how I always said that I wanted to do interior design?" I nodded, remembering her endless conversations about how she dreams about it, but never makes any real steps towards her goal. "I'm doing it right this time." There was a confidence in her voice that I hadn't heard before. "I take courses, get certificates, and create a real business plan. No abbreviations, no handouts." "And the financing?" I raised an eyebrow, holding back the skepticism that was still smoldering somewhere inside. "I'm starting small. I use my skills to create a portfolio. As soon as I have established myself, I will apply for a proper business loan." She took a deep breath, and then, for the first time in a long time, looked me straight in the eye. "No longer relying on family money." She paused before adding, "And without taking what doesn't belong to me." For the first time in many years, I actually saw my sister. Not the irresponsible woman who thought she had the right to dispose of someone else's property, not the one who was used to the fact that someone else would always pay for her mistakes, but the person she could have become when she finally decided to try for real. Jessica sighed heavily, staring into her coffee, as if gathering strength before the confession. "Mom and Dad are unhappy," she confessed, looking up at me. "They wanted me to fight the repayment plan. They tried to convince me that a loophole could be found, that you would back off anyway if we insisted." I nodded, not surprised, but still curious as to where it led. "But I didn't." She looked at me steadily. "I needed this wake-up call. All of us." She reached into her bag, pulled out a receipt, and placed it in front of me. "This is the first installment." I looked down at the receipt, then back at my sister. "Leave him alone." Jessica froze, her lips parted in surprise. "What?" "But send him to your certification courses," I clarified, crossing my arms over my chest. Her eyes widened, as if she was waiting for a trick. "But the repayment plan is still in place," I warned, not giving her false hopes. "This contribution is an investment in your future. Legitimate, this time." Her lips trembled, and tears glistened in her eyes, but they were not the tears I had seen before, not tears of manipulation, not an attempt to soften, not a theatrical gesture, but something much more sincere. "I'm so sorry, Tina, for everything." I just nodded. We sat for a while in a cozy, surprisingly light silence, in which there was neither tension or the former heaviness of our relationship. "Dad's selling his boat to cover some of the repairs," she finally said, breaking the silence. "He said it was the least he could do, considering he'd given you your key." I raised an eyebrow, which was unexpected. "And Mom?" Jessica grinned, but there was none of the condescension in her smile that had always accompanied conversations about her mother before. "Mom actually started working with a therapist." I couldn't help but feel a little surprised. "Really?" "Yes." Jessica shrugged her shoulders. "She says she needs to sort out her, what's it called, conniving tendencies." I nodded, digesting this. "Your actions didn't just wake me up," Jessica looked straight into my eyes. "They forced all of us to look at our patterns of behavior. The way we used to. The way we justified it with family ties." She packed up her things, clearly intending to leave. She had a course, and this time, for the first time, I knew she wouldn't give it up halfway. "I'm not apologizing yet," she said, zipping up her bag. "I know I need to earn it. But I want you to know, you did the right thing. Even if it seemed cruel at the time. You did something that none of us had the courage to do." I didn't answer. I just let those words settle inside me. When she left, I returned to my property. The midday sun poured through the windows, illuminating every corner that had been restored, every wall that had regained its former color, every inch of space that had become mine again. But perhaps it wasn't just the property that was repaired that evening. My phone vibrated with a new email. Subject: apologies and corrections. I opened it and felt like I was holding my breath for a moment. "Dear Tina, I'm selling my boat and some other assets. Not because Jessica asked me to, but because I need to fix mistakes. I gave you your key. Betrayed your trust." And then he had the audacity to defend this decision. "You deserve the best from your father. I'm sorry." I saved this letter, noting how different it was from all his previous messages, full of excuses and attempts to shift the blame. Change seemed to be possible when people were forced to face the consequences of their actions. The next day, my property manager sent me the final photos of the restoration. I was looking at them, and suddenly I realized something important. It wasn't just about protecting my investments. It was about setting boundaries. It's about demanding respect. About making difficult choices, putting justice above temporary peace. This house was mine again. Truly mine. But more importantly, my family has finally learned to respect not only my property, but also my right to stand up for myself. Sometimes the most valuable gift we can give our loved ones is the opportunity to grow up. Even if this opportunity is accompanied by legal notices and hard lessons. Sometimes the strongest foundations are built not on endless giving, but on clear boundaries and well-deserved respect. I stood in my renovated property, smiling. The walls weren't just repaired. They had become stronger. And me too.